Today's video is a little different. I'm going to do a case walkthrough, specifically the case I used to play my afternoon abstract set at Knobcon in Chicago just 2 weeks ago. I was delighted to be invited to do the afternoon session, so we had a 15-minute slot. I put together this dub techno performance case, and in this video I'm going to walk through how it worked, what worked well in it, what didn't work so well. As always, please leave any questions or comments down below on anything I'm covering in the setup today. And if you have any suggestions for better ways to play live and how to give a good performance and keep yourself calm, by all means let me know as well. And don't forget to hit the old subscribe button so that you can keep up to date with the channel. Anyway, let's get started with an overview of my setup. Well, here's the basic patch setup. So I've stripped away a lot of the wiring so we can see what's going on, and we're going to build it up. I did leave some of the audio path in place. And I'll start first of all with how I'm controlling everything here, and then we'll talk about the audio and we'll start wiring in different things and how it all builds up. So the audio and the control sort of flows left to right like you would expect, and I put the things that I touch the most here at the bottom. So I have my mixers, which are the Afterlater Bartender and Barback. You've seen me use them plenty. The link to a video on them is up above. One of my effects that I use for delays is C-Legs, and the other one over here is FX8. So they're on effects sense. Now I have 3 different sound sources in this setup. I've got the Flame Fire for drums over here. So if we just put it into manual mode, right, there's our drums, and that's all going to be sequenced over MIDI by the Oxi One. We'll get to the MIDI sequencing in just a minute. I've also got a Bastl Pizza here, which is going to do sort of lead and bass voices, and I've got the Neuzeit Warp here, which is like a fantastic polyphonic oscillator. It is in polyphonic mode. The light is blue on the expander, sequenced over MIDI, and that's for snappy dub chords. Finally, over here, I have the 1010 Bitbox, and what I'm using it for is ambient samples. That kind of thing that you always find in dub techno music. It's great for that. And that's going to be also triggered by the Oxi One. Now, how did I route the drum voices, and why did I route them this way? Well, first of all, if we just hit play here on the Oxi One, I've just muted everything except sequencer 4, which is going to sequence my drums. I'll get to this in a second in terms of sequencing, but let's take a listen. Now, we're just listening to tracks 3 and 4 here, which correspond to these 2 voices here. And I can morph the sounds, of course. On the Flame, it's one of its strengths. So you get this. Now, I'm feeding these through Endorphin's Ghost because I want to manipulate these as an additional source of sound. So we could, of course, filter it, and we can add some delay. And I'm also modulating the cutoff frequency here on Ghost using a stepped random out of Palms, which is being clocked from the Oxi One as well. So we're kind of working away here now. We've got various things going. We can also launch stuff manually if we feel it needs a bit of filling in. And we can go over here, start building up towards a drop with our high pass filter on the main output, and we're straight in with the kick. So far so good. We've got a bit of a groove going on. Now what about adding our chord stabs, because that's the essence of dub techno after all, are the kind of the chord stabs. And for this we're going to go over to the Warp, and on sequencer 2 here I have it set up to actually play different chord stabs. Let's take a listen. I'm going to unmute it. We're going to just set up the sound here. As you can hear, it's got that minor stab sound. Now, we want to send this into send 1. So I have this set to send 1, which is the C legs. I'm going to set up a master clock to be multed here out of output 1. PAMS is being started using the clock output here on the Oxi One. So you get a start and a reset. So I'm going to get one clock into here, into this mult, which I'm going to send to a few other places. But for this, I want it to be on a different division, so we get a slightly different clock vibe. So I've set up output 8 on PAMS to be divided by 1.5, so it'll be like a triplets clock, and we'll just patch this in here like that and get the cable out of the way. Now we hear that nice dubby delay effect. We've got the dry signal coming through and the wet signal. We can also do a little bit of modulation, but we'll get to that later. There's a lot more modulation we can add to this. Now on our sequencer, go to the arranger. Bring in a new groove. Just let that sit for a while. What this is now we're just getting a standard 4 on the floor. Let's say we wanted to add something new to this. Say we wanted to bring in a new rhythmic element or change this sound. We want to play around with it a bit. Let's use the delay scene here. Now the other thing is, I forgot, we need to clock. Send our clock into the clock input here on the Oxi Meta so that these are now clock synced. I bring in another rhythmic element here. This is on track 6, which corresponds to voice 6, which is a rim shot. If I want to mess around with it, I could send it into the C legs delay as well. But it's already going through this. So we've got plenty of delays and distortion going on. That's a nice kind of groove there. I have this on 1/2 time division. So this is kind of the basics, the basics of the performance case. We've got chord stamps here that we're going to be able to modulate with a lot of modulation coming out of Warp. We've got ambience coming out of Bitbox, and we have the drums and other percussive sounds coming out of Fire. And we're going to add one more thing next, which is we're going to bring in Pizza. We're going to do it in a slightly unusual way, and I'm going to show you that in just a second. Now let's look at how to bring in the final voice, which is the Pizza oscillator over here. Now this kind of worked on the night of the performance and kind of didn't, and I'm going to cover all of what I learned, what worked and what didn't, and what I would change at the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. My idea with Pizza was to be a little bit clever, and I wanted to take the 3 voices out of it and rhythmically combine them. And for that, I was using the Punch MG from Patching Panda. Now, Punch MG is a 4-channel VCA, but you feed it triggers, and it has a built-in attack decay envelope. So it's got a lovely snappy envelope, mixes the 4 channels together, which I was then going to feed into my mixer. And the idea was, I thought, it would be nice to actually rhythmically combine the different oscillator outputs, because Pizza has got a pulse oscillator output, a main oscillator output, and the octave oscillator, because it's got an FM engine inside it. Sequencer number 1 up here was going to be Pizza, and that's sequencing over MIDI. You might notice I'm not sending any CV and gates directly into anything here. And we'll get to the MIDI side in just a second. So we're going to patch MIDI Thing from Befaco, fabulous little MIDI interface module. So the pitch goes into the volt per octave input here. That's that output there. And then I have a gate trigger here. Now the gate is going to go into the trigger input of Punch MG. And what we're going to do, we'll use green cables, is we'll take, say, the main oscillator into 1, input 1 there. We'll take, the octave oscillator, say, into input 2, and we'll take the pulse oscillator into input 3. So let's just take that output there, that mix output, patch it into the input of 3 toms MS22 filter here, which fits wonderfully in a 3U row using this, 1U row, using this adapter here. I love it. And it just takes that harsh edge, which you can get sometimes on FM oscillator outputs. Just take the little bit harsh edge off. Okay, now I could adjust the pluckiness of the sound here. And of course, all this can be modulated. Final level there. Pizza is a very playable oscillator. You know, this is the wonderful thing about it. There's so many different ways you can just tweak it and modulate it, which is what we're going to do in a second. So let's just get those cables out of the way, bring the drums in. So I decided to modulate pizza using the velocity output here. So each of these notes has a randomized velocity. And I was going to use this to control the time, in other words, the release time of the attack release envelope that's built into Punch MG. And this is going to add just a little bit of movement. Now take a listen. So we get different notes of different velocities. I think this one is a pretty high velocity. If I turn that way down, you hear the release time on this built-in envelope here is being modulated, because if you look over here, the velocity is coming out, modulating time. Okay, so far so good. Now, we can of course trigger other things in Punch MG, and there were 2 ways I explored doing this. One worked well and one didn't. The one that worked well was just basically taking synchronized clocks here out of Pam's new workout, and I think I'll just use number 7 here. At this stage, I was kind of throwing things together in terms of what goes where. And now we can bring in each of the oscillator outputs individually. So I'm going to turn down number 1 here, and we'll just go into mute the drums here. So same melody. So we're going to listen to. Now that's 1 oscillator. Bring in the first one. And of course we could probably do a little filtering here. And I think I routed that up to the, we can send it into C legs. It's a bit too much though, I think. So I just sent it on send to here into the FX aid. Now, the other way I decided to try and modulate this was a little bit too complicated, and that was to actually set up the sequencer for Punch MG as a multi-track sequencer. It looks something like this, and these were where the notes were programmed in, because on the Oxi One you can have multi-track sequencers actually sequencing oscillator voices, so you could have 8 mono oscillators being sequenced here. And I set up extra gates here out of the Befaco MIDI thing, so it gets a little bit tricky on the patching. But what we've done now is we're now sending 3 gates over MIDI on 3 separate MIDI channels to Punch MG, which will now open up these 3 channels here, and we'll hear the 3 different oscillators. And you see these are all running at different speeds, so we kind of get this interesting sort of rhythmic effect going on. We can adjust the octave there using the tuning knob. Nice little bit of reverb coming off the FX8 on it. If I go in here, and by adjusting the sliders, I can bring in and out expand out the kind of the release, in other words, make each sound last a little bit longer. I also decided to get really clever then and start to modulate everything using velocity. And this is probably where I lost control of the patch, because by now you should think to yourself, well, hang on a second, you've got so much going on here. How can you possibly stay on top of it in a live performance when you've got loads of other voices going on? And you'd be right. So as wonderful as it was, when you combine this with the various other sound sources I have in here, and try and bring it all together. You hear that pizza sort of dominates. And I was doing a bit of modulation as well, using clocked envelopes out of palms here into the FM index. So I think my idea was good, but it didn't quite work, and it just gave me an awful lot to have to worry about on the night. And I think the lesson learned there, and we'll get to a few lessons learned at the end, but the lesson learned there is just, again, simplicity. And I was a little bit too focused on being clever over here instead of being quick and simple, because when you're playing, you just have too much going on, and you're standing in front of people, and it's all lots to take in. The final thing I want to talk about is how I did the sequencing, because this is actually a slightly different approach than how I would normally do it. I had a combination of MIDI modules, namely the Flame Fire, the Warp, and the Bitbox. Now, all of these can, of course, be controlled and played and modulated over CV and gate. But in a small case, it actually makes it very simple to just use MIDI. So MIDI to trigger the drums off sequencer 4 here on the Oxi One, MIDI to trigger the warp off sequencer 2 here on the Oxi, which was set up in chord mode. So each of these was a chord. Thank you, delay. And sequencer 3 to trigger the individual pads here on the Bitbox. And then over here, being CV and gate triggered, I needed a way to convert MIDI to CV gate, and for that I was using the Befaco MIDI Thing V2, which really is fantastic. I really learned how to use this module during this kind of setup and performance, and that's a great way I find to learn something. And so to do that, I set up one voice, as I was showing you earlier, with the pizza and all this modulation. And you can also have built-in LFOs here. You've got oscillators. This is a fantastic module. I might do a deep dive video on it at a future point. We have a lot of other MIDI routing to do, and you can't just use a regular mult-to-mult MIDI round. You need something special. And for this, I'm using the Tubbutec TRS-Bridge. It's a 6 HP module here. Absolutely fantastic. 4 ins, 4 outs. You can choose which of these inputs go to which of the outputs by simply tapping on them, and you can choose the routing setup. You can choose which are TRS-A outputs, the top 2, and TRS-B outputs here in blue at the bottom by just pressing those 2 buttons. You can save multiple setups. You can choose how clock gets routed. It's exactly what you need when you're dealing with MIDI devices in a modular setup. Now, why would I use something like this? I wanted 2 MIDI input sources to be merged. One was the Oxi One for my main sequencing, and the other one was this Fader Fox EC4 for control of parameters around on the patch. For example, filter cutoff over here on the different ambient samples. I had 4 outputs. MIDI Thing 2 and Bitbox are both TRS-A inputs, and Flame Fire and Warp are TRS-B inputs, but that's no problem because you can easily map that using those 2 button presses like I showed you. So the combination of the TRS-Bridge and MIDI Thing V2 was just a winner on the night. These were flawless, they were rock solid, no problems whatsoever. So what worked well on the night, or on the afternoon I should say, because it was an afternoon session, what worked well and what didn't work so well? What lessons have I learned, and what will I do differently in the future? And what I found on the night was I was trying to do too many things at once, and I was moving too fast, and I was jumping all over the place rather than just slowing down and letting the sound sit for a while before making a change. So my first lesson would be to move a little slower and let things sit for a while before you make a change. And if you do make a change with intention. It has to go somewhere. I think I was jumping around a little bit too much. Second thing I realized was I probably had too much going on in terms of control points. I had 8 different modulation here to morph the drum sounds. And that's great when you've got like you're doing it in, say, a studio setup. So if I had all these drums going, I can change everything around here, which is great fun and gets for a good groove going, but it's a lot to get your head around, a lot to control. You've got a lot of sequencing going on. You've got 8 different rhythmic voices and some of them going through here. So, I was playing around here. Fantastic fun in terms of like setting up a groove and keeping it going. Just a lot to get my head around. Another lesson learned was that the room itself, of course, sounds great when you're at home practicing. You got into the room and, obviously every room sounds different. And they'd done a good job with the setup. It was set up for quadraphonic, which this was only a stereo output. But to be honest, I had a tough time hearing what was going on. People said they loved it, and listening back to the recordings I got, they did sound decent. But what I had in my head versus what I performed on the night, 2 different things. And I think that's something I just have to learn and get used to, is to let go of these preconceived notions I have of what it would be and just kind of go with the flow. Right, those are the lessons learned. What worked well? Well, the MIDI side of things worked fantastic. So I highly recommend MIDI Thing V2 and the TRS-Bridge. The Oxi One, of course, is absolutely fantastic as my main sequencer. I left it in arranger mode, which means I could just tap and launch different patterns, combinations of drum patterns, combinations of chord progressions, and combinations here of different sequences to play on pizza. This was a lovely idea. It created a nice texture. So this also worked very well. I just kind of downloaded stuff, manipulated it a lot in Logic, and loaded it up onto the Bitbox. The Warp was great for those chord sounds. I had a lot of people asking me afterwards how I was producing them, and I showed them this and how it works. There's just so much powerful modulation here. You can do a lot with it. I have done a video on it. I want to do more with it in terms of videos. So yes, that was a winner as well. Overall, this was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. I had a lot of great feedback from people afterwards, people asking a lot of questions. So it was a real kind of scary thing for me to do, but I really enjoyed doing it, and I would definitely do it again. So I want to say a big thank you again to the Knobcon organizers and the people who are organizing the afternoon abstract sessions for inviting me to play, and indeed to the whole audience for sitting and listening to me attempt to make some sense out of what was in front of me. If you like these type of videos, if you want to see more of this type of content where I walk through cases, leave me a comment down below. If you have any questions on this setup or comments from people who are experienced performers, please teach me how to be better. Leave them down below and I will do my best to answer everybody's comments. Don't forget to subscribe to get more updates on videos from me on the channel, and thank you very much for watching. Now, as a little treat, here's a little segment of my live performance. I've posted this as a separate video. The link to it is up above, but just a little bit so you can see it all coming together on the night.